Hey everyone, I'm Sara Maria. It's a pleasure to be back at the Polyglot gathering. Thanks for being here. Just a heads up, this talk is pre-recorded. That means that we have an advantage of being able to communicate in real time during the talk in the chat. So the talk is recorded, but I'm also here, barring any technical issues, in the chat, ready to answer any questions in real time. So please feel free to put your questions there as we go through it. We'll also leave some extra time at the end for discussion. And the reason why we pre-recorded the talk actually was just to make sure, especially given the nature of the talk, that it really was as accessible as possible to everyone. So if you need English subtitles, there are English subtitles available. You should be able to just toggle those on. So I'll introduce myself. Like I said, my name is Sara Maria. I'm a linguist, which means a lot of different things to different people. But in my case, it means that I studied linguistics as an undergrad at university, then started a PhD in psycholinguistics, but ended up dropping out after 2 years to start my company. And that's a story that I won't go into now. But suffice to say, I'm very passionate about languages and the study of languages, which is linguistics. And the reason why I fell for languages in the first place and the study of language was that pretty early in my introduction to linguistics classes, I learned that language behaves in certain predictable ways. It behaves in predictable ways almost as if it were an animal that we could study or an organism that we could study and observe and run experiments on. And so much of the way that languages behave actually don't vary much, regardless of the language that we're talking about. So you have languages from Tongan to French that actually behave in very predictable and similar ways. And that just really blew my mind. And even though languages can look so different and sound so different from each other, they actually share so much in common. And what they share actually tells you a lot about how they work in the brain and how humans are hardwired for language. So in this talk, I'm going to make my case for why you should care about the commonalities, or universals as we call it in linguistics, and then I'll introduce you to sign language families so that you can learn a little bit about how sign languages work. Then I'll be going through some of the unique features that sign languages have, as well as some of the universals, some of the commonalities that are shared between signed and spoken language families. And then finally, we'll conclude with a discussion of why I think this all matters and why you, as language learners, language lovers, should care at all about sign languages. So before we jump in, I have to make my usual disclaimer. If you're a sign language researcher or a sign language specialist, then first of all, thank you so much for your fascinating work. I wouldn't be able to make this content without you, but just do be aware that in this 40-minute talk, I may be simplifying a lot of your very, very nuanced work in an effort to make these concepts presentable to laymen. So please do feel free to chime in the chat if you are here, if you are one of these people, if you want to clarify, or if you want to disagree, or if you want to update any of the knowledge that I hear. I'm very, very happy to hear from you. And to everyone else, I do recommend for these reasons that you dive deeper into any of the research that I talk about today. There are academics that are using really elegant experimental structures to study how these languages work and to let us know what we can learn from that in terms of how it works in the brain. So I definitely recommend that you dig deeper. This is going to be a surface level summary of the topic. So this often makes me think about another organism that has many different breeds and yet so much in common among the different breeds. For those of you who are listening and not watching, that organism is the dog. So when I first got my dog, it was my first dog. Her name was Pokey, and she would do all these crazy things that I thought represented her specific personality, Pokey's personality as a dog. So, for example, after we gave her a bath, she would always run around our apartment like a crazy dog, just barking and flipping around and acting completely nuts. She had completely lost the plot. And we thought that was so precious and so unique and just something really interesting about our Pokey. But of course, if you're a dog owner, you've probably learned that all dogs do that, or at least most dogs do that. This phenomenon is called the zoomies, and it appears to be a behavior that is instinctual rather than learned. So who knows why dogs do that, but we do know that it is an inherent part of being a dog. Now, since this talk is hosted by the Polyglot Gathering, I'm going to guess that many of you might be more interested in the differences between languages than the commonalities. Let me know if that's not the case in the chat. But I'm guessing that you came to languages because you were interested in speaking languages with tones, or languages with clicks, or maybe languages that allowed you to speak to people that are very different from who you are. I'm guessing that that was the initial impetus that brought you towards studying languages. If that's not the case, then let me know in the comments. I'll be very interested to hear. But let me make the case now for why it is interesting to hear about what sign languages and spoken languages have in common rather than what is different between them. And that's because, as interesting as it is to find out what's unique about languages, like, wow, Georgian numbers are based on a 20 system instead of a 10 system like English, or Turkish conjugates verbs based on truth values, those are super interesting, and I do plenty of talks on those topics as well. But it's also really interesting to see what all these different crazy languages have in common, no matter how historically removed, no matter how geographically removed they are from each other, no matter how culturally different, what they have in common, what's the same, because that gets at the heart of what language is. What is the essence of language? What is the system that we call language when we strip it of all of its trappings? So, how do we even talk about these commonalities? I'd like to introduce you to the concept of linguistic universals. And don't worry, I have to give you this. I have to give you some important vocabulary before we launch in. I promise there are going to be lots of interesting anecdotes and videos. But first, let me just give you some vocabulary that you need. So, universals are features that exist in all languages, or in some cases, almost all languages, or in languages that follow a certain typology. So for example, all languages have nouns and verbs. So we may write nouns and verbs differently, we may put spaces between them or not, or we may inflect them differently, but all languages have nouns and verbs. And by the way, throughout this talk, I will love to hear in the chat from people who can give linguistic examples, whether you're supporting the universal or whether you want to point out an exception or disagree with the universal. If anyone knows a language that does not have nouns and verbs, please put it in the chat. We'll be very interested to see. So languages can also be conditional or implicational, putting some kind of condition on that universal. For example, all spoken languages have consonants and vowels. So not all languages, but all spoken languages, because currently, as far as I'm aware, we haven't yet decided that there is any meaningful analog for consonants and vowels in sign languages. If you know of some research that points another way, then I will be very interested to know. So once again, one reason why we should care about linguistic universals is because they provide evidence for the capabilities and the constraints of our language brain, our brain that helps us learn languages. And I should mention that most of the initial research into linguistic universals was pioneered by American linguist Joseph Greenberg. So if you're interested more in this topic, you can hop on Google Scholar and just look up everything that he's done and every work in which he has been cited. So now we're getting more into the fun stuff. Let's talk about sign languages. So remember that languages in general can be grouped into many different kinds of typologies or different families. We have Romance languages, we have languages that use prepositions versus postpositions, we have languages that use click sounds, or you can also group languages by modality, so spoken languages or signed languages. So now let's talk about sign languages. Many of you may be familiar with at least one signed language, but I bet this topic is also brand new to many of you. I hope it is, in which case I might get the chance to blow your mind a little bit as I explain how sign languages work. So first off, I should make sure that everyone here understands that sign languages are indeed real languages in their own rights. They're not just a code. They're not just a transliteration of English or Spanish or Chinese. There is plenty of literature to support this, including Klima and Belugi, 1979. There's a great book that pulls together a lot of the research that supports the fact that we now know sign languages are real languages in their own right. They have their own standardized grammars, they have lexicons, and they're distinct from spoken languages. And they function in almost every way like spoken languages do, except that they use hands, arm, and face instead of tongue, lip, and air to get the message across. And secondly, sign languages are not just a manual version of a spoken language. So ASL, or American Sign Language, is not English on the hands. There is an English on the hands, signed English. That's a separate system, but it's different from American Sign Language. So if you made the following mistake, you can absolutely be forgiven. I made this mistake before I delved into this field, but I'm going to point out to you that you are likely holding two very different, incompatible misunderstandings in your head at the same time. You probably incorrectly believed that American Sign Language is just English on the hands, or Spanish Sign Language is just Spanish on the hands, while simultaneously believing that there was a universal sign language. So if you think about that for a second, you can realize that both cannot be true. In fact, neither are true. And I should technically clarify that indeed there is an international sign language. Signers do learn bits of this language and try to use it as, for example, conferences for the deaf. But at least in my understanding, international sign language is not as rich or it's not as rich or developed as most world sign languages. It's more of a pigeon, more of a means to an end, at least in my understanding. If you know otherwise, then please let me know in the chat. If you have a little more nuance to add to that, let us know. But if you want to know why there can't be a universal sign language, then, well, I'm sure you can ask any one of the 200, 300 Esperantists that show up to this conference every year. They'll be happy to explain to you what kinds of challenges they've experienced in trying to create an international spoken language. So I hope you understand why sign languages are going to face the same challenges that spoken languages would face in internationalization. There's nothing inherent to sign language that makes it more internationalizable. Okay, so here's a fun slide. So this is a map of the world sign language families that I found on Reddit. This doesn't show every sign language, but rather sign language families. So this is to point out that most countries do have their own sign languages. In fact, many countries have more than one because sign languages are less aligned with the political structures of the hearing people in a country than with deaf communities and deaf educational systems. So you'll find that regional variations tend to cluster more around deaf communities or schools for the deaf, universities for the deaf, or in areas where there's a genetic preponderance of deafness. So for example, in the US, we only see one color here now, but the US used to have at least two main sign languages, American Sign Language and Martha's Vineyard Sign Language. That's because for a long time, Martha's Vineyard had a much higher genetic incidence of deafness. And so they had created their own sign language there, which I believe, I may have to check this later, but I believe might even predate American Sign Language. So sign languages change, of course, and develop just like spoken languages, and those changes in that history don't always parallel the history of the spoken languages that are in those same regions. So for example, French Sign Language and American Sign Language, you'll notice, are part of the same family. They're actually much closer to each other than even American Sign Language and British Sign Language, which are in completely different language families. They're not mutually intelligible at all, even though they're found in countries where the spoken languages are the same, which is English. So British Sign Language is part of this blue family here, which you also see in Australia and South Africa. Oh, and the reason why American Sign Language and French Sign Language are related is because it was a French missionary that came to the US to establish one of the first schools for the deaf there. So that's why you'll see these families grouped in these ways. It's usually due to missionaries or other academics traveling to different parts of the world to establish sign language schools or communities, or they might have had a visit from someone that was very influential in some way. But I've always found it really interesting that these families don't mirror the families of spoken languages. Another good example is that Taiwan is actually part of the Japanese Sign Language family. They don't use Chinese Sign Language there. So I hope that this map helps make clear that sign languages are not inextricably tied to the spoken languages in their region. They have their own unique histories. So now that you understand the basics of how sign languages work, we can start comparing and contrasting them with spoken languages, ideally in a way that helps us to understand what is truly unique to signed languages and what is shared between signed and spoken languages. So before we jump into some of the drier linguistic features, I want to tell a story about what makes sign languages really unique and advantageous to use in certain situations. So I want to remind you that when you're speaking a language like English or Spanish or Chinese, you can't actually speak to other people very efficiently through glass. For example, through a window or through a subway window. Our language is not very efficient in those situations. So for example, if you're getting on a subway with a friend of yours and then your friend gets on right before the doors close, have you ever had that experience? And then you're trying to sign to each other, you're trying to gesture to each other through the window. Okay, you wait there and then I'll come meet you at the next stop. Our spoken languages do not work very well in those kinds of situations. Our spoken languages also don't work very well in noisy situations, like in clubs or discotheques or really loud parties. So I had this one experience where I was out one night, I was in a club with some deaf friends and some hearing friends, and it was really loud, of course. And to talk to my hearing friends, we'd have to shout into each other's ears, which is really unpleasant. Whereas my deaf friends were just easily signing from up close and far away. They could sign to each other on the opposite side of the club. And I remember one friend, a deaf friend, was kind of watching me for a while as I was struggling to communicate with my hearing friend. We're shouting into each other's ears. And she was just kind of watching me. And then at one point, she ended up signing to me, so who's the disabled person right now? So I thought that was just a good reminder that different languages have their own efficiencies, their own inefficiencies, and it's rarely completely clear-cut which one is the most advantageous in different situations. So we'll start out in a few more ways in which sign languages have unique features. This is one that I find really interesting, which is the way that sign languages use space as a grammatical marker. So I'll show you a video in a second, but there's nothing like this in spoken languages as far as I understand. I don't believe there are any spoken languages that use space as a grammatical marker. If you know of any, please let me know in the chat. I think everyone would be really interested to hear. But let's watch this video so you can get a sense of how that works.
When signing a sentence like, I like cookies and milk, the word and doesn't really exist in American Sign Language either. In this case, we use something called role shifting. So I would say, I like cookies. I'm signing off to one side, in this case, my left. And milk, I'm signing on my right. So I'm not doing something so dramatic, but it's a slight shift that we call role shifting. Cookies and milk. This is our and. This role shifting can also be used for or. For example, in the question, do you like cookies or milk? So we might sign cookies, milk, still doing the role shifting, and to show the or, we do the sign for which at the end. So again, those words and or, is, of, the, etc. Those small little words that we have in English, they don't exist in ASL.
Great. Now I'll just add on to that just because spoken languages don't use role shifting or don't use space as a grammatical marker doesn't mean that there aren't analogs in the spoken language world to the way that they're representing and or. So many world languages have novel ways of expressing and or. Many languages have several types of and or. If you speak Korean or if you've tried to study Korean, you know how complicated it is to say milk and cookies. There are many, many different ways that you could say it. Some languages do completely without and or altogether. So Chinese does have ways of saying and or, but you can also just leave it out in several types of instances, and that's fine. And just one last unique feature to sign languages, and that's using facial expressions as grammar. So I've studied sign languages for a while, but I'm not going to pretend to be a native signer. Right now, I wouldn't even consider myself fluent. I've forgotten a lot since I've been focusing on other languages for the last 10 years. But in fact, one of my biggest struggles when I use sign languages, according to my deaf friends, is that I don't use my face correctly. I don't use it grammatically and I don't use it consistently. So I'm going to show you some videos of native signers doing this so that I don't screw it up myself. But in these two videos I'm going to show you, you'll see the sign for ugly and the sign for dry. And you'll see that they're unique in almost every way. In fact, they're minimal pairs, which we'll talk about in a few slides, except for one component that makes the difference between the two, and that's the facial expression. So you'll have noticed that in ASL, facial expressions such as scrunched eyebrows or mouth shapes can make a difference in the meaning of the word. Often the signer will also make a mouth movement, sometimes one that looks very similar to what it would look like if they were actually speaking the English word. This once again doesn't happen because the language is the same as English, but rather it's a natural part of language contact. So since ASL and English are two languages that are in constant contact, you can imagine that they would probably be influenced by each other, sort of like the way English is influenced by French or Korean is influenced by Chinese. So I do always like to just clarify that just because you see the mouth movement mouthing dry, it's not because the sign is just a manual version of the spoken word, but it's mostly just an artifact of that language contact. And here are just a few other examples of what grammatical facial expressions look like in other sign languages. This is Israeli Sign Language, where facial expressions are used to mark different types of sentences to be declarative sentences, WH questions, yes or no questions. This is the face that's used for WH questions, for example, like what, where, why kinds of questions. And you might be tempted to dismiss this as non-linguistic. After all, hearing people do also use these facial expressions, right, when they're asking questions. But crucially, non-signers do not exhibit these facial expressions, sorry for my dog, as consistently as signers do. So in fact, my biggest accent when signing, my most telltale sign of not being a native speaker, is that I forget to use facial expressions grammatically. So much like how an English speaker might forget to use tones in Chinese, or how a French speaker forgets to pronounce the word initial H in a lot of words, hearing people forget to use facial expressions grammatically. Okay, but now let's pivot to the main event. Which features are shared between signed and spoken languages? There are many other features that are unique to sign languages, but I want to spend more time now on the commonalities because in addition to what I said before, I feel like it's counterintuitive to many people to understand that sign languages actually function many of the same ways that spoken languages do. So you'll remember the Greenberg universal that all languages have nouns and verbs, right? So indeed, sign languages are no different. Here are some nouns and verbs that exist in ASL, and in fact, in ASL, we mark nouns and verbs differently. So you use a repeated action for the noun. So for example, chair, and then you don't repeat that action if you're just saying the verb sit. And the same goes for plane or fly. There's a single action for fly, there's a repeated action for plane. So not all spoken languages mark the difference between nouns and verbs. English barely does. We say to sit, to speak, but in many cases, depending on how you inflect the verb, you can't really even tell. Spanish verbs and nouns are highly inflected. Russian nouns and verbs are highly inflected, but Chinese doesn't. Chinese doesn't mark nouns or verbs differently in any way. ASL is a sign language that does do that. If you know other sign languages, I'd be really interested to hear if there are sign languages that do not distinguish between nouns and verbs in that way. I myself have only studied American Sign, Nicaraguan Sign, and Chinese Sign, but my knowledge now of Nicaraguan Sign and Chinese Sign is very, very poor. So I'd be really interested to hear what other people have to say about that. Okay, now we're getting to one of my favorite commonalities between spoken and sign languages because this is so counterintuitive. So if we were doing this live, I would take the time to ask you first, how do you define phonology? Because usually linguists define phonology as the contrasting relationships among speech sounds that constitute the fundamental components of language. Or if you're a layperson and you don't really study linguistics, you might have even just said, oh, phonology is the study of sound, right? And you could be forgiven for making that assumption. But I'm going to update your knowledge on that because crucially it isn't just the study of sound, it's the study of sounds that are meaningful in any given language. So for example, if I whistle, that's not a phoneme in English. That's not phonologically interesting to us because whistling is not linguistic. Whistling does not change the meaning of a word. It might change the meaning in the Canarian language of silbo, for example, but in English that doesn't exist. However, in English, P and B are different phonemes because they can change the meaning of a word. They're two very different sounds that matter a lot for us. So now, thanks to sign languages research, we can understand that phonology does not rely only on sound. Really, the most essential part of phonology is identifying the smallest contrasting components of a language. So what is the smallest component that can change the meaning of a word? So I'm going to propose this alternative definition, which is that we're studying which components are meaningful and which components are not meaningful in a language. Because in both speech and sign, you will see both meaningless and meaningful components, and what counts as meaningful in one language might not be meaningful in another. So here's how we study phonology, and I'll bring up again this concept of minimal pairs. So minimal pairs are two different words that differ in just one phoneme. So for example, in English, rot and lot are minimal pairs because R and L are two different phonemes in English. In many other languages, such as Japanese, and to some extent Korean, R and L are not contrasting phonemes. They're just different ways of pronouncing the same sound. They're different variations on the same sound. So that's why Japanese speakers often struggle to distinguish between R and L, and in Japanese, you couldn't have a minimal pair that distinguishes between R and L. You'd never have two words that have R and L as the distinguishing sound. Now here's an example of something that is not a minimal pair in English, pot and pot. So because P and P are not two different phonemes in English, if I said pot to you, you'd probably still think that I was saying pot. You would just think that I puffed a little bit more air than usual. But in Korean, these two sounds, the P and the extra air P sound, are actually completely different phonemes. They do change the meaning of a word, so that would become a minimal pair in Korean. So Korean does have minimal pairs that use those sounds. So I'll show you some minimal pairs in ASL in a second. First, I want to talk about some of the phonemes. There's some of the parameters that ASL uses to create those minimal pairs. So hand shape is really important. So the way that your hand is shaped when you're making the sign, that's an important parameter. The location. So in ASL, signs will often happen a little bit to your right. They might happen at your chest. They might happen at different parts of your face. Sometimes the two hands will be working together, so location matters a lot. Different types of movement. So you remember that we had the difference between chair and sit. And then you also have mouth orientation, if you're mouthing a certain shape, or if your face is structured in a certain way. And then you also have palm orientation. That can also change the meaning of a word. So these are the parameters for ASL. I imagine that the parameters are slightly different in different sign languages. That's also something I'd love to hear more about. If you know a sign language that actually doesn't care about the type of movement or the location, or different kinds of hand shapes. So, if it really matters that the thumb is here versus here in certain languages, I'd be really interested to learn more about that, because that would be very analogous to how spoken languages work. So let's take a look at South African Sign Language hand shapes, because you'll remember that this is from a very different language family from American Sign Language. And I'm just going to take a look and see if I can find any hand shapes that you really don't see in American Sign Language. Yeah, for sure, this open flick, I guess it looks like this, if I'm doing that correctly. That's definitely a hand shape that I would not see in American Sign Language. Oh wow, I just found a really good one. The second finger is definitely a hand shape you would not see in polite American Sign Language. So you can also imagine that as a signer, whether they're deaf or whether they're hearing, if you grew up signing American Sign Language and you're very comfortable in American Sign Language, and then you go to learn a different sign language like South African Sign Language, you can imagine that your hands might not naturally move into a lot of these shapes, that it might be hard for you, even if we can copy it perfectly, if we're doing one shape at a time, the natural transitions that go from one hand shape to another might actually be more difficult for a non-native signer of that new sign language. So in that way, it's also very analogous to spoken languages, right? I can make, I think, most of the sounds that appear in Polish, but if I tried to put all the sounds together into a Polish word that has a lot of different consonants, that's something I'll really struggle with. So I think that's pretty analogous in sign languages as well. So the existence of these minimal pairs in sign languages is also, I think, very important support for the concept of sign language phonology, and why we shouldn't consider phonology as being constrained to sound and languages that use sound. So let's check out some minimal pairs in ASL. These are words that are completely the same except for one contrasting feature. For red, you do it in the same place, in the same location, in the same motion as sweet, but a very different hand shape. And this is a sign for red, and this is a sign for sweet. So same location, different hand shapes. Those are minimal pairs. So if I had more time, I'd go into slips of the hand, which are analogous to spoken language's slips of the tongue, but we don't have time to go into that today. But signers have tip of the tongue phenomenon. Signers make a lot of the same kinds of mistakes that speakers do as well. Okay, this is another really fun commonality as well. Researchers have found that signing babies and speaking babies go through almost identical stages of language acquisition, even though they're learning languages in two completely different modalities. So, assuming that the babies are exposed to sign language from birth, meaning that someone is signing to them, usually deaf parents, whether the baby is hearing or deaf themselves, they just need to get that input from a signer in order to have almost identical stages of language acquisition. So as an example, here's the stage of language acquisition. You've probably heard a baby of about 10 to 14 months go through the babbling stage, where they're producing consonant vowel productions that sound like ba 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 or ga 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 ga, right? So those are babies trying out new phonemes. Babies always go through this stage at about 10 to 14 months. And researchers have found that deaf babies go through that same stage, even though they do it manually. They babble in the same way that hearing babies do. So now we're going to watch a video of a baby with deaf parents. So she was exposed to sign languages since birth, and this is a video of her babbling manually. And here's just one last example of linguistic features that sign languages share with spoken languages. Signers can make grammaticality judgments, just like speakers of spoken languages. So what is a grammaticality judgment? It's basically when a language user knows if a sentence is correct or incorrect. So they're rendering a judgment on a sentence or phrase saying, yes, this sentence is grammatical, there are no fluency mistakes, or no, the sentence is not grammatical, native speakers would not say it that way. So being able to make grammaticality judgments, that's a sign of the standardization of a language. It's a sign that rules exist, even if we haven't figured out what the rules are yet. Because you probably have had the experience where you can just hear that a sentence is wrong or right in your native language, right? But you don't know why. You don't know what the rule is, but you can just tell that it's wrong. So when languages develop and when they change, these rules actually emerge naturally. And often academics have to kind of scramble behind them to figure out what the rules are and to figure out how to define them as they're emerging. It's actually not usually the way around. It's not that academics are defining the rules and teaching them to people, but rather languages are naturally developing these rules, and then academics are struggling to figure out what they are to define them. And then if the rules developed in a community of language speakers that have a particular amount of power, then generally they try to define those rules and ask other people to follow them as well. But that's something that a lot of people don't know, that a lot of language rules, a lot of grammar rules in languages aren't prescribed by academics, but rather arise naturally, just as something that happens in concert with our innate language learning device and what happens when we're in a group of other people that also share that language learning device. And if you're a linguist, you know that the language acquisition device is a term that's up for dispute and a concept that's up for dispute. But in my case, I really do believe that there is something innate about language learning. I won't get into all the debates of how far that goes or Chomsky deep structure, all of that. But I really do believe that there is something innate about the way that human brains process language. So here's an example of grammaticality judgments in sign language. This is with British Sign Language. These researchers were able to show that signers consistently and accurately render grammaticality judgments for British Sign Language sentences. And in fact, this particular experiment goes far beyond that. They're actually studying how the age of the acquisition of the sign language affects your ability to do grammaticality judgments. And they actually found that just as in spoken languages, there are clear trends for the age of acquisition in signers in terms of how accurately they render these grammaticality judgments. So, okay, we're coming to the end here. I've shown you examples of what makes sign languages unique. I've shown you examples of what makes them familiar, and I've shown you examples about what they have in common with spoken languages. What do I want you to take away from this talk? Mostly that language is not inextricable from sound. If we truly want to understand what language is and how it works, we need to examine its essence and not get distracted by the very many variations among languages, but rather we need to investigate what remains the same at its core. I really liked this quote from Sandler and Lilo Martin. The way sign language is acquired and the ease and speed of its transmission strongly support the view that a single cognitive system underlies language in both modalities. So if we want to understand how language works in the brain, you cannot restrict your study to spoken languages. You have to make sure that your data is diversified enough and looks into this really fascinating group of languages. So we've only touched upon the tip of the iceberg in this talk. There's so much more fascinating research that has already been done, and I've hardly even done justice to the nuance of the research that we've discussed. I've necessarily simplified a lot in order to fit in enough of these anecdotes. So if you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend that you hop on Google Scholar and follow the research that's being done in sign language linguistics and psycholinguistics today. I would be highly remiss if I did not mention the research being done on Nicaraguan Sign Language, which is a whole other rabbit hole, but also has really interesting implications for how language evolves, where it comes from, why it changes, how it interacts with cognition. It's almost criminal that I couldn't fit this research into this talk. Researchers that are working on that include Anne Senghas, Amber Martin, Jenny Pyers, Marie Coppola, Molly Flaherty, and Marie Kokab, many, many others that I wish I could mention. And those researchers are the reason why I even started going down this road. So if you guys are watching, I'm incredibly grateful that you took me along for the ride and got me interested in this topic in the first place. And finally, I highly recommend, if you're a language learner, if you're a language lover, that you try learning a sign language. Any one of the world's sign languages out there today. Italki actually has several sign language tutors. They have American Sign Language. I saw British Sign Language. I think I saw a few other sign languages up there as well. So there's no excuse not to do it. We're now living in an age where we can use Zoom to study, or we can use where we can record lessons on our computer and on our phone. So it's really easy to study a sign language, and it gives you so much insight into both the way that languages work and also into these really interesting cultures that coexist in the countries that we're living in already. You don't even have to travel, and you can get to know a really unique culture with its own literature, its own traditions. I highly recommend looking into that. This last year, I started studying Chinese Sign Language just on WeChat, which is basically like WhatsApp, with a teacher who's based in Wuhan. I'm in Beijing, but we studied remotely. There are always ways to find a teacher, so I hope you'll try it out. So if you guys have any questions, then leave them in the chat. Hopefully I can answer them by typing. I think we should have plenty of time. And if you want to follow me, I have a blog where I talk about similar language topics or language learning topics. You can also find me on Medium, where I publish a lot about language acquisition, language learning. And if you're interested in my company, it's a pretty different realm, but my company does translation and training data for machine learning purposes, but you can check out our company website there. And here are a couple of resources that were big sources for this talk. So if you're interested, you can check that out. So thanks so much for coming, and I'll take questions.